Hello, David. Hello. Hello, Peter.
Hello.
Hello, sir.
So nice to see you, Professor Suba.
Welcome. Yes, most welcome, sir.
Nice to meet you online.
Indeed, indeed.
Yes, sir. Yes. Sir, we are.
And look forward. Yes.
So we can start the program now. We are live.
Yes. Um,
Sir, namaskar. Look forward to listening to your lecture. So we're starting with something from the St. Anthony's College, right?
no, sir, sir, you can directly lead us now. It's over to you, sir.
No, the program says that there's a prayer and opening remark.
Yes.
By Brother Albert Dakar.
I am here,
Yeah,
sir.
brother, please you can
Is there some?
start, sir.
Yes, Brother Dakar, please start.
Yes. Bablu, am I audible?
Yes, brother.
Okay. Respected Reverend Father Dr. George Tadatil, Professor David Palmer, Professor T. Subba, Mr. Peter Lepcha, attendees from around the world, warm greetings to all of us. We shall start with a prayer as we begin this webinar. Let's bow down our head in prayer. Dear Almighty Father, I am deeply grateful for this opportunity to be a part of this webinar series and of the many talks that we are and will be hosting in the future. I commit all our efforts and our plans into your hands. I pray that you will bless our talk sessions today. The moderator, Professor T. Subba, the resource person, Professor David Palmer, Reverend Father Dr. George Taratil, the principal of the Salesian College Sonada and Siliguri, Mr. Lepcha, faculty of the Salesian College, the technical team here, and all our valued attendees. I pray that the webinar will prove to be a blessing to everyone who is participating and attending. Guide our hearts and minds as we interact with the various topics that our resource persons will be engaging us with. In your name we pray, through our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. As I pondered on the theme of our webinar series, my mind was drawn to the words mountain and meditation. I realized that this was not the original way in which the themes have been structured, but the two words juxtaposed in such a way conjured for me the images that come straight out of the pages of the Bible. Mountain tops and the valleys have been the locations for many significant occurrences recorded in the Bible, but mountain tops in particular have deep spiritual and geographical significance, especially in the life of Christ. The highest geographical point in the region is often the site where altars are installed, offerings are given, and covenants made, not just because it has a commanding view of the land from above, but especially because it is considered to be closer to the heavens and therefore closer to God. Mountains are imposing structure on any landscape, and they evoke emotions of various hues in the hearts of men, reverence being one of them. On the other hand, for some, mountains are objects to be conquered and subdued, launching the brave and the inspired to undertake expeditions to the highest peaks. For a few, Mountains invite them to a life of isolation and peace. Christ saw mountains as the best rendezvous points to fellowship with his Father in heaven. The Gospels record him waking before the sun rose to make his way to the mountains to pray before his day began, to draw strength and obtain guidance for work that lay ahead for him. The mountains bore witness to his battle with Satan as he faced the latter's temptations, one after the other during his days of fasting in the wilderness. Who can forget his famous sermons on the mount where he expounded on spiritual truths for the benefit of the people of the land? And as he neared the final days of his life, he made his way up another mountain to be transfigured and revealed in all his heavenly glory before three of his disciples, flanked by prophets of all. And when it came time for him to conclude his earthly ministry, it was yet another mountain that saw him give up his life into the hands of his Father. Christ's relationship with mountains was one of fellowship, of conflict, of glorification, and the consummation of his ministry, and each instance, his posture was one of meditation on the express objective of the ministry, on the strength of his Father's words, on the glory that belonged to him, and on the death and resurrection that was part and parcel of his earthly ministry. The theme of this webinar series and the physical conference that will be held in future resolves around similar relationships as established by other religious communities and those who would not consider themselves religious but spiritual. But the beauty of the series and the conference lies in the fact that these experiences and relationships are being studied, examined, interpreted by scholars and researchers from various disciplines and institutions, bringing in a blend of the mind, that the heart, of the soul and the spirit, of the physical and immaterial. We will attempt through the series and the conference to take an objective look at something that is at once subjective and personal, to not only understand but convey its essence to the world outside the ranges of the Himalayas. It is my privilege to join with the members of the organizing institution to invite you to go with us on this amazing journey to the heart of the Himalayan region and participate in the religious practice thriving there. Thank you, God bless you, and all the best for this webinar series.
Thank you, Brother Dakar, for your prayers and for those opening remarks, which are very religious, but also I think they sanctify the beginning of this seminar. If Father George is ready, I can see a small patch of him, but if he's ready, would you come in and introduce this webinar series?
Yes, sir, I'm ready and willing.
I would particularly like to hear from you why you chose so many words with M in the subtitle of this seminar. Mountains, minorities, meditations, monasteries, medicines, and mendicants. So something about that as well. Something must be working behind this framing of this subtitle. So
Well,
Father George.
sir, thank you. Well, another M explains that mystery.
Okay, all right.
And Mysterium Tremendum has been Otto Frank leading us all into the entire discourse on religious experiences, taking on from William James. So I guess mystery, mysticism, when you think of religious experience, takes us to this particular location. Well, to be more specific, thank you, sir. Let me first of all do my duty of welcoming the key figures of this series. With us today, Professor David Palmer, I met him in the year 2016, and there are people whom you meet at a conference and you know that there is something of a future with that person. And that is precisely that has happened in the series of encounters that followed thereon. And I'm glad that the meeting that took place just in 2018 between Professor Subba and Professor David in the mountain of Sonada is having this continuity with the virtual gathering being spearheaded from the mountain of Shillong. And he is an expert in history, religious studies, and sociology, coming from the academic background of University of Paris, as well as Oxford, as well as the London University, London School of Economics. And he has a number of publications that took him into limelight in this field of sociology and religious studies. Just to mention his religious question in China and the Qigong fever, body science and utopia, and his dream tippers on the global Taoism and the predicament of modern spirituality. So, this concern with his interest in sociology of religion, anthropology of religion, took him to the project of Bring Faith, which brings us all, in fact, together. In between, in Sonada, in Solution Research Center, we had an application from one of our colleagues and former faculty from Assam Silchar University Department of Philosophy, who was interested in exploring the monastic life of the Buddhists and to compare that with the Catholic kind of monasticism and the kind of meditative practices that goes on in the Catholic institutions. Both St. Anthony's and Salesian College of the Don Bosco network that is there in 132 countries, both started in the entire world as first institutions in India itself, in the background of, the intent of a generation of young men who traveled all the way from France and Malta and Italy and Germany and Ireland to join this project of Salesian education, which by way of Don Bosco has become a household name in not even in third tier cities across India. So we have that kind of legacy and patrimony of which both of you are aware. And therefore, that research center project and this Bring Faith attempt to explore religious practices in the Himalayan spaces, which keeps apart, even as the present circumstances that we are all aware of, on a kind of standoff of engagement on borders of the entire Chinese civilizational history and the Indian civilizational history. And what do we as academics, as research scholars, as sociologists, as persons interested in religious studies, cultural studies, how do we bring an engagement of a different order than the kind of engagement, let's say, that's happening on the borders not far away from these very same Himalayan spaces? And well, that's our responsibility. And therefore, we honestly thought of bringing, like-minded individuals from across the world who are interested in exploring and journeying with us on this exploration of religiosity, spirituality, the spiritual dimensions of the human living in border spaces and in borderlands and in difficult terrains. Now, having said that, I'm very glad, sir, that you have accepted to be the moderator, because one thing is to look at it from a kind of global positioning where, let's say, David comes from, as he from Canada, traversing into Europe and traversing into Hong Kong, and trying to bring the Chinese religiosity to the world across from Hong Kong University, where he runs the very excellent program, which I've directly heard from students how his courses are so popular and so multimedia friendly. The religious studies of China that goes on there. And we need to balance that, or rather we need to engage with that from very local specific expertise. And that's what we have in the person of Professor T.V. Subba, who is associated with NEHU, and he was former Vice Chancellor of Sikkim Central University. And of course, first of all, I should start by saying a great friend and a co-sojourner with the entire solution world of, be it in Shillong, or be it in Sikkim, or be it in Darjeeling or elsewhere. So, and he is associated with SAI, the South Asian Institute in Heidelberg, with SOAS in London. He's on editorial boards of a number of anthropology and sociology journals across of eminence in the world, and he is known for his works, The Quiet Hills, a study of the agrarian relations in the sub-Himalayan regions, and he's also has his other book called Flight and Adaptation, a study on the Tibetan refugees in the Himalayan regions, again, of Sikkim and Darjeeling. And he has done a study and published on ethnicity, state, and development, a case study of the Gokaland movement. And he has, the other one is the politics of culture, the study of three indigenous communities, the Kirata communities in the Eastern Himalayas. So here we have a specialist on Eastern Himalayas going to engage with and moderate this series of lectures that we are going to have, as Brother Albert, the principal of St. Anthony's College, the host of this event, for the real event, which, by the way, when the committee met, we decided that we shall not just exchange the real one for the virtual, nor be satisfied with only the in-presence event that will take place whenever that is possible, but we would do blended learning, that which we are all in the academia by now becoming very familiar with. So we are having these series of lectures as a preparation, and I am saying this to all our scholar friends across the board listening to us, that if anything that triggers you is in relationship with your area of interest, as we have, for example, Yadavpur University, represented by Professor Rafat Ali, who is himself again from Kalimpong, and we wish him condolence because his own uncle, who was a very eminent figure in interfaith dialogue, just recently passed away. And yesterday's Telegraph had a beautiful write-up on him. So we have in the person of Professor Subba, the expert on Himalayan region and the religiosity. So having said this, and I would like to take one step forward to say that when Professor Subba and David met for the first time in Sonada, it was in the context of an Asia Network faculty enhancement program, where Professor Subba addressed the visiting team of 10 professors from different universities of the US, and talking about the specific feature of Darjeeling, used a phrase, and I want to take our attention for a moment there. He used the word sedimented syncretism, that when borders meet, when religions come together, when faiths do attempt to coexist, the usual thing is to say, oh, someone is attempting something syncretic, and syncretisms of various types that we have seen. But having lived and having been part of and having anthropologically explored the uniqueness of this region, he coined this word to say it is not simply syncretism, it is sedimented syncretism. And I'm sure, this kind of a depth of analysis of what happens in small locations and in small locations across the mountain spaces is what this series, whether it is mendicants and medicines, whether it is monasteries and meditations, whether it is mountains and minorities, that we are trying to delve into and create a kind of, a hope at the end of the day, because we are living through times where it's so very easy to be disillusioned, especially if we are in academia or in the interface between academics and activism. I think of people like Medha Patkar or even Arundhati Roy, people who have been in academia and administration and, trying to fight the system. And when we see things don't make headway, where are we? So with these few words, and over to you, sir. Thank you.
Father George, I hope you're sure that the speaker this afternoon is not me. is Professor Palmer, right?
You're right.
I mean, someone who I got the impression that that I would be going to speak. So
You will
no,
be moderating, so you will be with us for more than today's lecture by David Palmer. And David Palmer will talk to us about religion, the religious practices, method in religion, and about how this method in religion, of which he is an expert, can be applied to the Himalayan spaces. With these few words, back to the moderator to hand over to the speaker of the day.
Okay, Father George is of course you have introduced Professor Palmer. I'm in the midst of fathers, so I'm sorry I addressed Professor Palmer as Father Palmer. Almost did that. So this can happen if David, if I address you as Father David, please don't mind. Okay. So is someone going to introduce him formally, or is your introduction?
Yes, that is it. More of it
Okay.
on anyone interested has got a huge list of his accomplishments and awards in the Google.
It's okay.
Yes.
All right, then. Well, now invite Professor David Palmer to deliver his address. The topic, I don't know whether it stands or it has changed. It's written as Asian religion as method in the mountains, a Jomian Himalayan perspective. This sounds very interesting because a friend of mine who's a historian called William Van Sandel, he's been the one who's talked about Jomias for the first time. And he's well known for his theory on Jomias. So I'm not sure whether you're going to talk about him, but he's really the kind of authority on the Jomias. I mean, much before David Scott started talking about it, it was William Van Sandel who wrote quite a lot about the Jomias of the Southeast Asian societies. So I look forward to listening to you. Also, for one reason that recently one of my very young colleagues has proposed to contribute an entry on Himalayas as method.
Oh.
For a kind of companion that I'm doing with a student of mine on Northeast India. So I haven't read his write-up yet, but this sounds very, very interesting and promising for me. So I look forward to listening to you, Professor Palmer. Please go ahead now.
Yes, okay. First of all, just let me check, can everybody hear me? Is the audio okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Okay, well, thank you so much, Professor Subha, for this, and Father George, for this introduction. I have to say how much it's a blessing to have this chance to give this presentation. Of course, originally we had been planning to hold this this seminar in person, and I was really looking forward to visiting Shillong and to have this conference over there last May. And I hope that we'll be able to do it once the pandemic is over. But I just really want to express my appreciation to Father George, whom I've met several years ago, and we've had so many wonderful exchanges in Hong Kong, in India, in Indonesia, and I've always appreciated Father George's efforts to put academic research into practice and also to build interfaith friendship and harmony within the highly diverse religious ecology of northeastern India. And I have to say also that I'm just so excited. I really am so excited today to be able to speak to an audience primarily of Indians. In fact, I think it's the first time in my life that I've given a talk, although I'm not physically in India, but with an Indian audience. And I'm also delighted that I think there's some other listeners from other parts of the world. And I wish I could see all your faces so that I could see your reactions to what I'm saying. So I hope that in your questions, I'll be able to get a sense. So to be honest, I don't know if what I'm going to say is just going to be completely absurd from an Indian perspective. So we'll see. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is, let me see. I'm going to share my PowerPoint. Let me see here. Okay, is my PowerPoint visible?
Yes, sir. It is.
Okay, all right. So the talk, the title of this presentation is Asian Religion as Method in the Mountains, a Zomian Himalayan Perspective. So another M, method. So we had so many M's, and I know that as we were discussing this this seminar series, we kept on adding more and more M's. Well, so today this is how my presentation is going to be organized. First of all, I'm going to be talking about the present moment and how I see, what is it in the current present moment that leads me to think about this question of Asian religion as method, and what is its significance and importance. And the second part is going to be really to look at how can we refocus the discussion on religion into an Asian and inter-Asian approach. And the third is, well, that Asian or inter-Asian approach leads us to think of other conceptions of religions than the dominant secular Western conception of religion that dominates the academic discourse. And that leads me to thinking a little bit deeper into some of the ontologies and practices of Asian religions, which relate to different modes of relating to different types of entities in the world and the universe. And finally, my thinking and my talk will reach Northeast India in the framing of Zomia in the Himalayan region, and thinking about, thinking up and down the mountains. So to begin with, I mean, we're living in special times, and many of us are in fact in this kind of forced retreat, in a kind of a forced meditation because of different types of lockdowns and all of the restrictions on our social life, which are caused by the pandemic. So in a sense, much of our life has been, to some degrees, in pause, and many parts of our economic and social life, in fact, are being torn through all the hardships and the suffering of many people who have been hit by the COVID-19 and their dear ones, their families, their friends. And so we're in a time where in fact we find ourselves as humans in many ways, to some degrees, somewhat helpless. And this also happens at a time when so many others of the structures that seem to order our world are being torn apart or falling apart, whether it's within our own country or region with different groups, the tensions and conflicts between different groups on the rise, or whether the political systems seem to be increasingly dysfunctional, or even whether the international order itself doesn't seem to be functioning very well anymore. And so when we see all of this, I really like the Indian conception of Leela. And so we might think, what is this in the divine play? The way the world is being churned up, and we're caught up in all of these transformations. And so I just want to think about that a little bit more, about the notion of Leela, the notion of play, as I understand it, in a very, taking this notion to start thinking in a very perhaps superficial way. But we think then in the games that we play. I'm an anthropologist, and in anthropology and in sociology, our social life is very much conceived of as, in a sense, as a play. We talk about the roles that we play in social life, the roles that we might play as father, as wife, as son, as daughter, as teacher, as students, as worker. So we're all playing roles in the different aspects of our life. There's in sociological theories, for example, there's the front stage and there's the backstage. So in a sense, all our life is playing a game or playing different games in our life. And some of these games are destructive. And some of the games, when we've played them for a very long time, at a certain age, they might have been appropriate, but then as we grow up and we have more capacity to harm each other, some of these games become destructive. So there are destructive games, but also there are constructive games too. And so I think now we're in a time when a lot of the old games, according to which our world, our lives have been organized, some of these games are falling apart. And we've got to learn to figure out what are the new games, or what is the new way to play. And I don't think we know. And so this is really an important turning point that humanity is finding itself in. And so I think that when I'm talking today, I'm not going to be proposing some kind of set methodology or some kind of set theory, but really what I'm going to be talking about when I talk about Asian religion as method is how can we find within Asian religions some ideas and ways of thinking that can help us as we together try to find out what is the new type of game, what is the new type of play that we can play together as human beings in our world. And we're in a time when, whether it's the modern types of games or the ancient types of games, none of them are really functioning. And so I'm not suggesting that we should revive some ancient traditions. But what I'm going to be suggesting is how can we delve into our different spiritual traditions, our religious traditions in Asia, and what kinds of methods of thinking, what kinds of methods of doing might help us as we try to construct, as we try to design new mindsets, new mental operating systems, new ways of functioning in our society. And this is something that has no easy answer, and I'm certainly not going to be suggesting any answers today. But this is kind of this is the direction of the talk that I'm going to be giving today. It's kind of the direction of my thinking. And so when we have, let me see, what is my slide saying here? Right, as we try to find and to create new games, so then we need any new game, let's say any new sport, any new practice, there are methods involved. We need to learn how. So this is one way that I'm understanding the notion of method here. And I'm also thinking that in the past, we learned how to play together in villages, right? We learned how to play together in small mountain communities. We learned how to play together in cities. But really, we're still struggling to learn how to play together in highly diverse, multicultural and multi-religious environments within one country and even within the whole world. And yet that's what we have to learn. We have to learn how to play together. And if we learn how to play together, we'll be united and we'll be happy. And so I think that's the spirit in which I propose to look at Asian religion as method. So an inter-Asian approach. Now, the first thing, as I suggest this, is, well, one might be wondering, I mean, who am I to speak about Asia? I'm not born in Asia. I'm not racially Asian. And so it actually might be a little presumptuous for me to have anything to say about this topic. And even within Asia, I'm a specialist on Chinese religion and society, and I have no expertise whatsoever on any other Asian society or culture. So I really should say that I come here in a learning mode, and I don't come here to present what is Asian religion, and to, right, you know, I come here as somebody who's been trying to be in this learning mode for many years. So I'm a migrant to Asia. So I know that many Asians migrate to other countries and to my own home country of Canada, but I've migrated the other way. I first came to Asia, actually to Pakistan in the late 1980s. And then I've spent much of the 1990s in Asia, in China, and all of the past much of the past 2 decades also. So I've really moved here, and my life is here, and my future is here in Asia. So I speak as somebody who's migrated, fallen in love with Asia, and is still learning as a lifelong endeavor. And of course, whether it's talking about Asia in general, or whether it's talking about one particular country in Asia, especially as I cross over now, speaking, for example, about India or to Indians, and we'll always encounter different types of stereotypes. And that's something I want to talk about when I'm talking about inter-Asian conversations. It's very interesting because so I live in Hong Kong, and I've previously lived in mainland China. And this is regions that are often considered to be not so religious. And then we have this stereotype about India that it's very, very religious. So that's the kind of the stereotype we have. But of course, our stereotypes can be wrong. It's funny, when I've been to India just a few times, 3 times to be exact. And I had this impression that in India, there are sacred cows walking all over the place in the cities. And to be honest, where I live in Hong Kong, would you believe it? Believe it or not, there are feral cows who wander around the streets in my village, wild cows. And I have to say that when I went to India, I didn't see that many cows in the streets of Calcutta or Chennai. And I see more cows in the streets of the new territories of Hong Kong where I live. So that's one stereotype. And another one, I thought that when I went to India, I thought there would be temples all over the place. But when I've been to India, well, I did see a lot of temples. But actually, if you go to a place which is replete with Chinese culture, such as Taiwan, and even, again, Hong Kong, I'd say that there are actually just as many, the kind of the density or the number of temples is pretty much very comparable. And of course, in mainland China, it's different. But if you go to some of the rural areas in the countryside, one would be surprised. So an inter-Asian conversation is one where I think it's interesting. It would be interesting to look at, to confront and compare our different religious cultures, and to do so without taking the Western conception of religion as our standard. One of the another thing that I realized when I visited India was that, in fact, on the one hand, Chinese temples and Indian Hindu temples, in many ways, they're very comparable because they're all very localized. They're not part of a big, a big organization, and they have many gods and deities enshrined inside the temple. And so in many ways, and what people pray for, they pray for happiness and prosperity, they pray for health, they pray for business, they pray for exams, and they also pray for transcendental motivations too. But in many ways, I think that there's very, very comparable. But there was one thing that I saw that was different, is that if you go to a Chinese temple, it's wide in a sense. One can walk in, and then immediately the gods are wide open. You can go directly to the gods and pray to them. There's no priest. But when you go to an Indian temple, there's a very, very narrow passage. So in a sense, the access to the god is limited. And then there is a priest who is there standing beside the god. And in a sense, we receive the blessing from the priest. So it's very interesting. In one place, the access to the god is actually more it's harder to access the God, and there's that mediation of the priest to access the God. And in the Chinese side, one can directly go and access the God. And it's quite interesting because China was defined as a country that has no religion by Western scholars and Chinese intellectuals who were influenced by Western scholars. And one of the reasons was that when you go into the Chinese temple, you won't see a priest. Of course, there are priests, but they aren't standing there and controlling or playing a dominant role in that act of worship. So it's really for that reason that Chinese religion was defined until recently as not a religion at all, even though there are so many temples, so many gods, and so on. So an inter-Asian connection, an inter-Asian conversation, I think would be very interesting. One that is not mediated or not fully mediated by Western secular conceptions of religion. But when I talk about Asian religion as method, of course, then one might ask the question, well, what is Asia anyway? And I don't want to give a definition. I'm speaking of a region that has no, in fact, that has no clear borders, that you can look at with different centers and from different perspectives, that one could even consider Europe itself to be an extension, a peninsula at the western extension of Asia. And so I deliberately want to leave the notion of Asia undefined. And when I talk about Asian religion as method, I'm taking direct inspiration from the Taiwanese scholar, Chen Guangxing, who wrote a book, Asia as Method Toward De-Imperialization. And he was inspired by a lecture given by the Japanese scholar Takeuchi Yoshimi in 1960, where he talked about Asia as method. And basically what the idea is, in a sense, in a post-colonial context, or a context of post-colonial theory, is how to find new frames of reference that are not the Western frame of reference. So multiplying our frames of reference and our subjectivity and worldview through the histories and cultures of Asian societies, albeit acknowledging the West as constitutive of Asian subjectivity. But the thing that I found, though, in many of these post-colonial discourses is that they tend to be still within a very secularist mode. And most of the post-colonial discourses have not, at least in my experience, have not really directly and seriously engaged with the ontologies that exist, with the ontologies and practices, the cosmologies that are deeply prevalent within Asian societies and cultures. And so in a sense, when I talk about Asian religion as method, I want to build on the notion of Asia as method, but I want to say, well, wait a minute here. If you want to take Asia as method, you have to deal with what we call religion, with the religious underpinnings of these Asian subjectivities, worldviews, cosmologies, and ontologies. But I mean, what is Asian religion then? Well, again, I want to leave this, I don't want to define this. So the point of talking about Asian religion as method is to shift the center of gravity of our reference points. It's interesting that whether we're in China or India or Indonesia or other Asian countries, no matter where we are, it seems that the West is always the reference point. So Chinese people are always talking about China and the West. Indian people are always talking about India and the West. Japanese people are always talking about Japan and the West. So everybody has a common reference point, which is the West. So can we can we remove the West as the central reference point? So this is the question I want to ask. But then also it's very important for me, why would I define it as Asian religion as method and not as, let's say, Chinese religion as method? Because you could do exactly the same thing. You could say, well, let's use Chinese ontologies and cosmologies, or Indian ontologies and cosmologies. And one certainly could do that. But then one enters into a highly nation-centered, nation-state-centered mindset. And so, in fact, what's so interesting about the notion of Asia is that it has no national or civilizational center. So Asia itself is decentered, and that allows us to decenter our own mental operating systems. And it forces us to always to place ourselves in different positions. So this is an important point that I want to make about Asia. And in a minute, toward the end of my talk, I'll talk about the Zomi lane.
There's some problem with the audio. There's some problem with the audio. Can someone fix it?
Peter, if you could ask David Parma to
Yes,
disconnect
I will do that.
Connect again, rejoin again.
Sure, I'm doing it right away.
Only he has to do that?
Yes, if he disconnect and connect, then he will come back.
Okay, I think he is doing that.
Father, so Subha, if you could just ask the audience to have patience and wait.
Yeah.
Yes, please
Dr.
wait for a few. Hello, everybody. Please hold on for a few minutes.
Yes, he's just coming in.
There is an audio problem.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Good. We're back. My apologies to everybody. All right. So,
But your slides have gone, so
yes.
please pull them back.
Yes. All right. Are we okay?
Yes, sir.
Can you see my slide? Okay.
Yes.
Right. So I wanted to say that looking at to think about Asian religion, I include Christianity and Islam in this broader theme. Of course, I mean, that is simply a fact since both of these religions have originated in Asia. But even more than that, though, you know, often we consider Christianity to be a Western religion, and Islam is, if not considered to be Western, but considered to be often far away over there in the Middle East. But we forget that the majority of Muslims in the world and a very large proportion of the Christians in the world actually live in Asia. And if we see then Asia as the center of Christianity and Islam, then it makes us rethink, you know, how do we understand these religions? Right, what about Indian Christianity, Islam in India, in Indonesia, in Pakistan, in these countries that are more farther east? So how does that how do we rethink these religions when we think of when we center them in Asia? And so but I want to also say that as I propose a kind of an Asian centering of our discourse on religion, is that does not exclude Western conceptions and Western practices, because we have to remember that Western civilization, secularism, and science are now deeply part of the Asian cultural DNA. And they can no longer be extracted from any Asian culture, I believe. So then what can we do instead? right, is right, I'll get back a little later, but is a kind of a geological
Hello again. We have lost the audio. May I suggest that except David Palmer, rest of us we switch off our video.
And all of these are sedimented and actually coexisting, sometimes visible, sometimes invisible. So, however, as we then advance towards or try to find some inspirations to conceive of religion from an Asian perspective, we need to think of, okay, well, what's the problem though with the modern Western conception of religion? And so basically, just in a nutshell, and I don't know how that's understood in India, for example, but in the Western secular context, well, basically religious people, they believe in something, they believe in God, but the focus is really on belief here. So you believe in this thing that is not rational. So there's this distinction between belief on the one hand and rationality on the other hand. And so if we're engaging in the study of religion, the academic study of religion, for example, basically we stand on the side of the rational people who are studying these other people who have these beliefs, and we might respect them, but these beliefs are non-empirical and non-rational. And so there's this distinction between belief and rationality, and actually a division of humanity into two categories of people: the religious people who believe in things, and the rational people who don't need to believe in things. So this is the first kind of distinction. But then also there's the idea that if you believe in one thing, well, then that by definition means that you don't believe in other things. So the belief in this entails the non-belief in that. So an exclusive kind of binary understanding of what belief actually entails. And then another really important point is what I would say is the notion of affirmed belief versus embodied belief. So this is very interesting. And actually, I'll just share a story to explain this idea. I have a friend who used to live in Hong Kong. She's American. She married a Hong Kong Chinese man. And well, they had had a courtship, for a very long time, and so my American friend, she proposed to the Chinese man that why don't we get married? And he agreed, but he said, on one condition: I will never say I love you. Now, from a Western and actually from a modern romantic perspective, this might seem to be very shocking. But actually what I noticed as I observed this couple, and actually my American friend is a member of my religious community. She's a Baha'i and her husband was not. And what I saw is that he accompanied her to all activities. He was a real gentleman. And in his acts, in his care for her, I saw what is absolutely and truly genuine love. So for him, and this is actually part of maybe traditional Chinese culture, and I don't know what it would be in Indian culture, for example, what really matters is the act, what you do, and it's not the verbal expression. So from his perspective, and I've heard other people say the same, you say, I love you, that doesn't really mean anything. What really matters is what you're actually doing. But we have this in the modern conception of religion, is really what actually really counts as the affirmed belief. You say something. You say, I believe in this. I'm a member of this religion. So I had once I had some students, and they had to do some field research on some kind of religious practice or some kind of cultural practice in Hong Kong. And one pair of students, they researched people who practice Tai Chi exercises in the morning in the parks in Hong Kong. And there were some videos of, the students made some videos and they interviewed, and they were very, very good practitioners of these Tai Chi gymnastics. But they asked the Tai Chi practitioners, so do you believe in, are you religious? Do you believe in a religion? And they said, no. But actually, I would say, well, they don't say they're religious, and maybe they don't affirm they're religious, but this Tai Chi movement is actually a full embodiment of the Taoist cosmology. So in their act, in their embodiment, they're absolutely Taoist, even though they make no claim, no affirmed claim to be Taoist. So, but in the secular Western understanding of religion, what matters really the most is the affirmation. And then the idea then is that social identities and groups are based on affirmed belief. So you have the group of those who claim to be this religion, and by claiming to be this religion, then they are distinct and opposed to those who claim to be the other religion. So these are some, and we don't have time to go into more depth on these issues, but this is some aspects of the modern Western conception of religion that I think are deserving of a critique. And another aspect is what I would call the Westphalian religion. So basically, ever since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, emerged the notion of an international order where there are a single sovereignty over a well-defined territory. So within a certain very clearly defined line of territorial bounds, there is only one sovereign authority. So then we end up with all these nation states, each with their own flag, for example. But another aspect of the Westphalian conception is that each Westphalian state has its religion. So one nation has one religion, one majority religion, and then it might have minority religions. But this is very clear this is very important for the construction of a Westphalian nation state. So the state needs to construct itself with its clear boundaries, with its own culture, with its boundaries, and with its religion. And all of these need to map onto that very distinct and exclusive boundary. So as I proposed, and in many ways similar to Professor Suba, is a sedimented approach to Asian culture, religion, society, or a geological approach, where we have all these layers. And often you can't really see, you see one layer of rock, and you don't really see that underneath that there's another layer. And that's also a really, really important foundation. And under that layer, there's another layer. And under that layer, there's another layer. But sometimes there are these folds in the rock, and these other layers erupt and become visible. So in China, we have the visible layer, which is the communist, the socialist, which is atheist. But then under that, we have the Confucian layer. And then under that, we have the Taoist layer. And then under that, we have the animist layer. And so there are so many layers, and the more you explore and the more you dig, then the more you will find out that that first layer that you see may only be a very superficial one. And it is misleading, perhaps. So, when we are living within this society, in fact, all of those layers, we embody all of those layers within our own lives. So we may claim to be one thing, but all of these other things, the other layers are there. They are consciously or unconsciously in our minds and in our bodies. And they influence the way that we act and live our lives. So then what might be some other ways of thinking about religion if we delve into the Asian traditions? So, right, well, we have the Indian, and I think I can learn far more from you. You know, the notion of, so what's, you know, we talk about the dharma, right? The principles that sustain the world and also by which we lead our lives. And I know that this concept is so deep, and I'm not doing justice to it just in this few sentences, so my apologies right away. But what's very interesting, and this is in a sense where I take the notion of Asian religion as method, is that in Chinese, the dharma is translated as fa, and fa means method. So it's actually a way of doing things, a method for living your life. Now, of course, then in Chinese, we have the notion of Dao, right? So a way, a path. So what's a path for living our lives? What's a path for building our societies? We also have the notion of lisu, rights and customs, which is somewhat as might have some equivalencies with the notion of adat, which exists in Malaysia and Indonesia, the notion of customary norms, rules, and interdictions. In Chinese, we have the notion of teaching. So we have the three teachings, Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. And what's interesting is just like you can study different disciplines at school, you can take psychology and mathematics. You can also take Confucianism and Taoism and Buddhism. You can take these different teachings at the same time. You can practice them together in your life. In Islam, we have the notion of deen, the way of life to follow in submission to God. Agama, which actually I believe is an Indian term originally and still widely used in Malaysia and Indonesia, rites and worship based on sacred texts. And actually what's interesting, if we go to the pre-modern West, then we have the note, what does religion actually mean in the pre-modern West? And it's a bit different from what we understand today. For example, in medieval English, religion was life under monastic vows. And that came from the Old French, which means piety and devotion. So religion in this context means piety and devotion. And it comes from the Latin religare, to bind, referring to the bond between humans and gods. But it also means an inner spiritual disposition, conscientiousness, the sense of rights and moral obligation. So then what I want to do here is by presenting these different conceptions, and they're not really, they somewhat overlap and they're somewhat different, but is to, in a sense, blast open the notion of religion, to see that there's so many different ways that we can approach. And in a sense, many of these different conceptions can lead us to different ways of comparing, different ways of finding new insights. What if we compare the agamat of different societies? What if we compare the Tao, the ways of different societies, the methods of different societies, the dharmas of different societies and cultures? So let's think about that. And really though, no matter what, whether we're looking at dharma, din, devotion, or Tao, at the end of it, underlying it all is how to connect to the one, or how to be one. And here is something that, there's something that in the Asian religious traditions then, is something that where there's been deep reflections and thought and practices, which is really which is the notion of non-dualism, how to transcend the dualism which is inherent in the way that we experience our lives in this world, and how to move into a non-dualistic, into oneness with the cosmos, with God, with the world. And so, of course, we have this extremely rich, so many different, exquisitely rich traditions in the different Asian religious traditions, which engage with the notion and the dynamic between dualism and non-dualism and oneness and so on. These are very rich conceptually, and they're also very rich in the practice of the individual life. So how can we start thinking about now what might be a practical non-dualism? In a sense, how can we be non-dualistic without actually retreating into a cave? Or if we have retreated into the cave, and I'll get to that in a few minutes, you know, if we step out of the cave back into this society, how can we bring a non-dualism into our real life, where we actually have highly dualistic divisions between ourselves and others, between different groups? So what might be a practical non-dualism? So this is a question nowadays I'm really asking myself. So how can we use a non-dualistic, how can some of these rich intellectual, spiritual resources of non-dualism help us to learn how to play the game together? So now then, right, seeing then in these different forms of non-dualism, different modes of relating. How do we relate to what exists in the world? Actually, what things is the world made of? And how can we relate to these things? Now, in our intellectual training, in our Western style intellectual training, we tend to see the world as made of objects. We objectify things. We objectify things and separate them from us. And so it's through objectification that we learn how to know about the world. Even in religious studies and the academic field of religious studies, we objectify a religious group or religious community, and then we learn how to describe it as an external entity. So we tend to treat everything as objects, even people. We treat human beings as objects. We objectify first, we objectify them analytically, methodologically, and then after having done that, we have a tendency to objectify them in our practice. So that's one way of dealing, of relating with the world, is by objectifying. But another one is through treating beings as persons. And so we can see, and I think, not what happens when we treat not only human beings as persons, but what happens when we treat non-humans as persons. And actually, this is a question that anthropology in recent years has really been developing or been inquiring a lot. What happens when we treat mountains as persons? When we treat trees as persons? What does it mean to treat a tree, a mountain, a rock, an invisible force as persons? So this is one way of relating. Or what about if we start what if we treat the beings or the entities in the universe as energies? And something that we see a lot in actually both Indian and Chinese cosmologies. Well, what does that entail? What if we treat all of these beings as spirits? What if we treat them all as agglomerations, temporary comings together of different elements that will dissolve? What if we treat all of these things as mental images? And so all of these, in the popular culture or in the highly developed intellectual and religious traditions, we have a lot of conceptualizations and a lot of practices related to these different ways of relating to the beings in the world. Now, if we treat religion as a question of belief, then maybe when you see this list, you might say, I agree with number 1, or I agree with number 3 here, energies. You pick and choose. This is the one I believe in. No, I don't believe in that. But if we take Asian religion as method, then maybe we might see it differently. It's not a question of, well, what do you agree with, or what do you believe and what do you not believe? But what's the method to start to understand, to relate to the world in that way? How can we experience relating to a being as a person? How can we experience relating to a being as energies? How can we experience relating to a being as a mental image, or as an agglomeration, or as an illusion? So before making judgments, how about if we learn the different methods of relating to the beings that constitute our world? And so if we do that, if we're doing that, what would be the method of doing that? And what would be the implications? What would be the implications of treating beings as objects, of treating them as persons, or as energies, as spirits, or agglomerations, illusions, mental image? What are the implications for the way that we play our game together, for the way we learn how to live our lives together? So I'm not suggesting that we should simply, we need to treat all beings in this way or that way, but let's explore that, and let's explore the implications of different modes of relating. Another aspect that we can find in Asian religions is thinking with the body. And certainly this is something that I've studied a lot in Chinese practices, and I know that in India it's also highly developed. Well, what does it mean to actually think with the whole body? In our in the intellectual or Western intellectual tradition that we're all trained in fact, we learn to think in a disembodied manner. In a sense, we learn to think in a kind of an empty space where we have different points in what's a straight line, a straight logical or intellectual line from one to the other, where we have the law of contradiction, where if something is A, it cannot be B. But our body doesn't function that way. One part of my body is operating in one direction, another part of my body is operating in a different direction, doing different things. And yet it's coordinated. So what does it mean to actually think with the body? When we learn methods to think with the whole body, well, what does that mean? What are the implications of that? Or what about actually to think completely outside the body, which we also find, for example, in many Buddhist, Hindu, and even Christian traditions. What are the implications to actually completely detach ourselves from our body? So in a sense, to objectify our body, or to take it as separate from ourselves. So it's very interesting. We can either think in the body, think through the body, or think outside the body. What are the implications of thinking these different ways? And what does it mean to think with the landscape? Again, the way we're trained to think is one in which, we're thinking in an abstract mental space. But what about what happens when our mental our mental operation takes place in relation to the landscape that surrounds us. When we are inspired or we're led to think in a certain way by the features of the landscape that surround us. And this is what brings us to the mountains, thinking. So I wanted to talk about thinking up and down the mountains. And actually our introductory words, the beautiful introductory words by Brother Dakar, very much illustrated my point, that rising up to walking and climbing a mountain is also a way of thinking, even if we're not physically climbing the mountain. But the mountain itself leads our mind upward. It leads the image of the mountain leads our mind to come closer to heaven. So in a place like Shillong, in places like Darjeeling, in the Himalayas, so we have valleys, we have rivers and gurgling brooks, we have springs with water gushing out, we have caves, we have high peaks and mountains, we have journeys to cover on foot. And all of these different features of our environment can guide and can lead our minds to think along with the landscape, to think into the deep mysteries by mentally or physically entering the cave, to enter a mode of nurturing when we consider the valley and the community that is living together in the valley, to think of purity, for our minds to be purified by thinking of or living close to a gushing spring of fresh water, and to ascend in a difficult, challenging ascent as we climb the mountains and come into a more rarefied atmosphere, closer and closer to the divine. So here's where I come to the notion of zomia. Now, zomia is actually what the anthropologist James Scott, and who was himself drawing on the work of Van Schendel, he used this term to describe the mountainous region, which the continental mountainous massif of Southeast Asia, which includes Southwest China, Northeast India, and the mountainous regions of Laos, Thailand, Myanmar, and even down to Malaysia, if one wishes. And according to other authors, also extending to the Himalayan regions of Bhutan, Nepal, southern Tibet, and even into Afghanistan for some authors as well. And so this whole region, which has been called zomia, in James Scott's formulation, it has some special characteristics. So these are regions which, in a sense, they are populated by different peoples who have either voluntarily or forcefully, they've fled the lowlands. They've fled the rice cultivating lowlands and the empires of the lowlands. So whether it's the Chinese empires of the Yangtze and Yellow rivers, whether it's the empires of which are now in southern Thailand or southern Burma, or whether it's also the kingdoms of India. And so in this space, this mountainous, rugged space in between of all these empires, there are all these incredibly differentiated populations, these incredibly differentiated tribes, social groups, which have unbelievably, it's impossible to even identify in a very stable and consistent way what ethnic group they belong to. There are so many changes and transformations. There's so much diversity. And for James Scott, for many of these groups, they've actually voluntarily, they are not primitive vestiges of some ancient times. They may be people who have voluntarily, even not so long ago, maybe only a few hundred years ago, who have left the lowlands and settled up in the mountains to stay away from the taxation and from the burdens of civilization. And these places are isolated. They're up in the valleys, up in the mountains, and so this isolation makes them highly differentiated from one another, but they're also deeply connected. There are so many trade routes, so many circulations. And so the connections between the highlands and the lowlands are also quite deep. And so this Zomia is a land of high differentiation, high diversity, but it's all, and a land of people who want to be away from the lowlands, but it's also a space of connection, a space of connection between the high and the low. And I want to think about this also in terms of in spiritual terms. The highlands are often conceived of, and often by the lowland people, they're conceived of as the place where you go up into the mountains for spiritual cultivation. You go into the caves to become a hermit. It's in these mountains, among these tribes, that you have those who know the magic, who have powerful spirituality. The lowlands, by contrast, are considered to be the places where the people are cunning, where they've been corrupted by civilization. And yet they're also important because that's where we have order, where we have high levels of social development and organization. So in a sense, there's a complementary relationship between the highlands and the lowlands. This makes me think of the Chinese notion of Tiandiren, of heaven, earth, and humans. So as humans, we live between the earth, which is the lowlands, and heaven, which is up in heaven, and we live in between that. And that's what it is to be human. It's not to be completely spiritual, nor to be completely material, but it's to be in that in-between space. And so in a sense, Zomia, these highlands of the Northeast India, Southwest China, the Northern Southeast Asia, and the Himalayan regions, these are regions where human beings, they ascend into, they leave the highland, they leave the lowlands, they go and ascend closer to heaven. They acquire some distance from that materialistic lowland. And so they reach up to the heavens. But then I want to ask the question, so we gain some insights. We engage in these practices in the rarefied atmosphere of the mountains, coming close to the heavens, but then we'll come back down. And so what will we bring to the earth below, to the world below when we come back down? Well, there's one thing that I think that we can bring. If we consider the region of Zomia, it's a region that is in between these great civilizations and empires. It's in between China and India and these other agrarian civilizations of Southeast Asia. But when you ascend the mountain, high up on the mountain, and then you look around 360 degrees, you've transcended those divisions. And you found yourself in the pivot around which all of these civilizations are located. So how can we bring those insights from being up there in the mountains? How can we bring those insights back down to the world below? And so this is what I would invite us all to think about. How can we think up and down the mountains? And as we do that, how can we imagine, how can we experiment with, how can we find methods for different modes of relating? How can we gain insights from other conceptions of religion? How can we engage in an inter-Asian dialogue, inter-Asian approaches? And how can all of these insights, how can all of these methods allow us to learn new ways of playing the game, which will be relevant to the present moment? Thank you very much.
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Palmer, for this wonderful presentation. I don't think anyone can summarize what you have presented so wonderfully. Since as per the program, I'm not going to get another chance to say anything about this presentation. I would like to just say that I enjoyed thoroughly whatever you presented. There were a couple of places where of course we could always disagree, or I could cast my doubts about what you said. But that's part of the game. right? That's part of the play, part of the Leela
That's
that
right.
we play in academics. Right? For
That's
instance,
right.
you said that, well, you didn't see many cows in some of the Indian cities. Well, I've seen plenty of them, and in some of the cities like Varanasi. So blocking the way, roads, etc., etc. So also perhaps saying that your claim that Christian and Islam originated in Asia and they are Asian religions. Well, to call it Asian is much safer than to say they're Indian religions. Perhaps there may not be there may not be many in India who would agree that Christian and Islam are Indian religions. But to the extent you say that they are Asian religions, perhaps it may be accepted with some kind of a reservation. I think towards the end of you spiritualize the theories of Willem Van Sandel and David Scott, which I found it very fantastic. And I'll share with them that there was one professor called David Palmer who spiritualized your theories very, very wonderfully, actually. So I'll write to Willem and David Scott very soon, if tomorrow, if not today itself. All right. So it was wonderful. Now, though we have crossed the time a little bit, I wanted to give you the times of kind of signal, but I was enjoying the lecture so much that I didn't want to kind of interrupt in between. So now it's question and answer session. But before I really open it, there's one question that has come in already by Preeti Oza. Okay, and her question is like this: how does the affirmed belief affect the faith of a person? Do you think that the affirmed belief keeps changing? So your answer, please.
A fond belief? Fond belief?
Yes, this is about this binary between affirmed belief and embodied belief.
Oh, affirmed belief.
The question is, how does the affirmed belief affect the faith of a person?
Right.
Do you think that the affirmed belief keeps changing?
Right. Oh, that's a really good question. Yes, thank you, Preeti. Right, because actually, I don't want to actually, in kind of making this argument, I don't want to deny the importance of affirmed belief. In fact, I always say "I love you" to my wife. So I practice affirmation. I'm also an affirmed, a declared Baha'i, in my own religion. So the affirmation of belief is certainly, something that exists. And in a sense, I think you raise an important point, because it actually, to make an affirmation then makes it's a kind of a commitment that then you are held to account, right? So then people are going to say, oh, you said "I love you," but do you really? Right? So it's actually, the affirmation is perhaps an important way to hold yourself to account by putting it into the public. And then now the question is, can your embodiment actually rise up to the standard of your affirmed belief? So yeah, that's an important, that's an interesting question. What I guess the point that I want to make here, though, is that I think we need to, at least I think in the kind of the Western conceptualization of religion, as it's at least superficially often understood, it's used to label people according to their affirmations. And of course, as anthropologists, we already know that's not necessarily the case, and we will go as anthropological researchers to go on what are they actually doing. But actually, outside of anthropology, I've noticed that that's not, most people don't really think that way. And so they think, oh, you say you are this, and that's what you are. So I think we, and I notice especially in Asia that people are often much more subtle, not necessarily direct in the way that they talk. And they might be making an important statement without saying it. And they have that wisdom of, well, let's look at what you're actually doing, And so I think we should think about that. We should use that. We should use that insight. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Palmer. From the chat section, it appears that many of those who had registered couldn't open the site. So maybe Peter could look into these issues in future. There is one which is a kind of a question, a very general question from Emma H. Jung. She wants to know, is there a difference in the way Asians adopt Christianity in comparison with Europeans? I'm thinking about Taiping Tian Guo in Qing Dynasty, China.
Okay. Well, actually, I don't know enough, as my area of research that I research being Chinese, Chinese indigenous religion, I have not really done research on Asian Christians, and I know Asian Christians. In fact, several of them, they are our hosts today, and I'm absolutely grateful. And I've learned a lot actually by visiting some Christian sites in India and Indonesia and also in China and other places. But I just don't know enough. I really couldn't answer the question. And I don't know. And plus, there's so many variations, I think, in Christianity, both in the West and in Asia. So I think that must be just a huge area of academic inquiry. And what you were saying about the Taiping Tianguo, so the heavenly the heavenly empire of the supreme peace of the mid-19th century in China, right? That was a kind of what we could say is a millenarian movement that was inspired to some degree by Christianity and by some visions that were derived from or inspired by Christianity. But it's certainly a mutant, a major mutant. It would hardly be considered Christian nowadays. But that's an example of some elements of Christianity kind of entering into the local culture. And especially, it's interesting that in Zomia, in this region, there are many ethnic groups that are Christian, but they've integrated elements of the local culture in pretty unusual ways. In fact, I just learned last week that among the tribe that are called the Zhou, actually, so I guess Zomia comes from this particular ethnic group, the Zhou, who live in right near the Myanmar border. And there's a religious movement there that is inspired by Christianity, but they actually also claim themselves to be Jews. But they also claim to have fled from the Great Wall of China, from China all the way to this region of the Chin state in Myanmar and in India. So this is what's also so interesting in this region of Zomia is how many of these different ethnic groups, they often choose a religion that is different from that of the lowlands. So you will have more Christians up in these mountains than you will have in the lowlands, which is quite interesting. The religion is often different from the lowland religion. So, of course, there might be a lot of debates as to why that is. Yeah.
Yeah, interestingly, that's really so. You have in the plains, you have Hindus or Muslims. In the temperate climate, middle hills, you have Christians, and in the high hills, alpine areas, you have Buddhists. I don't know why the glass ceiling of the altitude the Christians couldn't really break, or the Hindus couldn't break the same kind of glass ceiling as far as the high altitudes are concerned. There is one
That's so interesting.
Yes, from the chat section again, we have Father George, who's your host, asking you this question. Could there be a notion of indigeneity specific to the mountains? in terms of the cultural, tribal, community worldviews, rather than as an escape from or a modulation of what happened in the plains. Shall I repeat this?
Right. Yeah, I think I heard the question. Right. So what would be a notion of indigeneity of the people of the
Specific to the
mountains?
mountains, yes.
Specific to the mountains, yeah. So, right, I mean, I think actually this notion that, and that was criticized in James Scott's understanding of Zomia, that in a sense he really seems to define the mountainous indigenous people as almost as if their only purpose to be there is to get away from the plains. And so it's and of course I think
as fugitives, mostly.
Yes,
as fugitives,
right. And so
from
of
the
course,
plains.
yeah. So that seems to be, I mean, I'm not at all an expert in this region, although I've been doing some research in Laos recently, but I don't know enough about the region. But surely, I mean, I think this James Scott's idea is too far-fetched if you take it too strongly, right? So then what is the, how does indigeneity, what would that be? And I think it would be important to think of what I was just talking about, thinking with the landscape, right? That, you know, what does it mean to be for a particular group in a particular place? Well, I don't think that meaning can be abstracted from the physical environment. And so in mountain regions, the physical environment is so diverse, so different and unique in every location. So I would wonder, well, how does the landscape actually affect the indigeneity of specific peoples in specific in mountain regions? Yeah.
Professor Palmer, I would like to take two more questions from the chat section. This is from George Dunn. The question is, religious conflicts in the West have often centered around different and incompatible religious affirmations. Do you believe the emphasis on embodied religion may account for there being less religious conflict in China?
Yes, that's a very good question, and I would say so. And the reason I would say so is because, because affirmation uses language, and so it is a statement. Any statement necessarily implies and generates it generates its contradiction, and any statement is incompatible with any number of other statements. But the body is actually, in a sense, the body can incorporate so much, and so the body is not merely the absence of statements. So there is something there, and there is something so rich, something so profound in the body, both in the inner body and the inner life of the body, and also the diversity of expressions of the body. And so, and as we build, when we play a game with people, we're actually playing an embodied game. And so perhaps, you know, maybe that's why there are more conflicts now in the world of social media, because people are communicating in a more disembodied fashion. Whereas when people are in physical presence, well, there is always the bodies adjust to each other, and so they learn to be more civil with each other. So I really think that there's something there. And so affirmation does exist in the Chinese tradition and in Chinese religious traditions, but it is, I think it exists on the surface, but with a strong rooting in something in the body, which can actually absorb so much. The body can absorb and integrate so much. Yeah. Yeah.
The last question that I would like to take up is from Gregory Thomas. He says, I think mountain spirituality, under quotes, would be the most relevant in interreligious dialogues. Would you agree?
Well, actually, I probably wouldn't agree that it's the most important, but I don't know enough about it. But I certainly think there's really something. It's a very, very interesting and probably, potentially very, very important angle to engage in interreligious dialogue. And I think, so as was brought up in the introduction to this webinar series, so we have Catholic contemplatives in the mountains, and we have Buddhist contemplatives in the mountains. And so precisely that, the embodied experience of this rarefied air, of this landscape, of coming closer to the ultimate reality, and the being in a cave and cut off from so many external perceptions, then allows us to turn inward, to observe the life of the mind. And so those things then end up being they're the same, because they are embodied experiences. And then out of there, spiritual and religious insights can arise. And from that point, then the commonalities between the two traditions, or the different traditions, can be identified, as well as the differences. So I agree, because there's a real common experiential foundation that then allows for the different discursive traditions and ritual traditions to engage in a dialogue about their commonalities and differences. Yeah. So I think it's a very good starting point for dialogue. Yeah.
Professor Palmer, can I just take one more very moral question? Yeah, the question is from Annie, and she wants to know, many people today, especially the young, are moved by spirituality more than by religion. Is this a good trend?
I'd say that yes and no. I mean, I'd say that yes, in the sense that what we have is that the reason for this trend, partly, is that the traditional structures that have structured spiritual life in the past, many of them have kind of fallen apart, and partly because those traditional structures, which tend to be called religion, those traditional structures were deeply tied in with traditional forms of social relationships. And so as those social structures have transformed, those religious structures have kind of been either fallen apart, or they've been marginalized. And so people have become more they've become free individuals in a sense, and they've started to identify with a spirituality that does not affirm itself as religious. And within that spirituality, then there's a lot of freedom to experiment, to try different things, to explore different things, and so on. And so in one sense, I think this is really an expression of the day that we're in, the moment that we're in, the moment of transformation that we're in. But ultimately, then, these free individuals, spiritual individuals, do need to learn how to play a game together. And so the so-called traditional religion has community structures. So it teaches how to live together, how to practice life together, how to engage in, how to create a community. And an individualistic, free-floating spirituality is actually missing that very important point, that very important dimension. And so, I think this is a process, but this process of, I think, collective exploration must eventually lead to the formation, right, of learning how to play a game together. In other words, learning how to create community together. And so that's something that we need to remember in these discussions of spirituality.
Well, Professor Palmer, it was great listening to you, and thank you for this wonderful presentation. I can see now that you have grayed a lot. Your hair has grayed a lot from what I've seen last, both physically and perhaps intellectually. So now with these words, may I now invite Peter Lepcher to propose a formal vote of thanks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you
Peter.
so much. Yes, thank you. I have a great joy and honor to be proposing the vote of thanks in this very august gathering of the different participants and the panelists here. A great friend of ours, when I say Dr. Palmer, for Salesian College and for St. Anthony's, and I personally have been in connection with him for a not very long time, but he came across to me as a very warm person when we met. And then I recall the times that we spent together in Kalimpong Park Hotel, sitting together, discussing different faith. And especially I was talking about the Kalimpong chapter, about the Lepcha community, the religious practices over there. And you were particularly taken aback to hear about the Samaj system, the way we organize ourselves, smaller village communities coming together. Dr. Palmer, your rich experience that you shared, we are really grateful as the host institutions, St. Anthony's and Salesian College. Thank you so much for sparing your time and being with us this afternoon for your night there. Definitely we will be catching up with you when you come to in 2021 to Siloam in Shillong, Meghalaya, and I think we can sit together once again. In the person of Dr. T.B. Subba, who is facilitating and moderating today's event, and we have come to the close. Dr. Subba, thank you so very much. I had a very brief sitting with him in Salesian College, because I was in the next room and he was just about to go when Dr. Palmer and others had come. So we just had a sort of, he left the room and I came in and just like that in person. But definitely he is a towering person in anthropology, and I have been following him with Professor Virginius Kaka, our family. I'm related to him, so therefore I know him for a very, very long time. Of course, sir, perhaps he does not know, but that way, and also reading his articles, and he has been a leading academician. And we are very honored, sir, that you are with us, and you have also consented to walk with us in this webinar series, as well as the final contact mode 1 in 2021, or whenever that would be possible in Siloam. Thank you so much for being with us. We have 4 collaborating institutions, and we would like to thank from the farthest from my center here in Siliguri, and that is the University of Hong Kong, represented by Dr. David Palmer, and kindly give our warm regards to all your colleagues and friends, especially those who are nearby you, and also the Bryn Faith about whom Dr. Palmer was speaking earlier on. So we would sincerely extend our heartfelt gratitude, and also our friend and also our sister concern, St. Anthony's College, Shillong, who has been part of this, and in the person of Brother Albert, who is here. Brother, thank you so much. And also Mr. Jacob, thank you so much, and Mr. Rajak, who has been part of this organizing team and manning and womaning the whole process of this webinar there. Thank you so much. And also there, the attendees and the participants, we have 45, presently 38, but there were earlier on more. And in YouTube, in between, I was checking, there were also more there. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. It was really an honor to be part of this program for the institution that I represent, that is Salesian College, Siliguri and Sonada. And thank you so very much, each and everyone, for being with us. Once again, thank you so much. Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you, Peter. Now, it's the turn of Father George. It's open-ended. The time is open-ended, but I hope you'll realize that it's already gotten dark. In Ceylon is already dark. So, so use your discretion.
Thank you. In other words, better to end before I begin. So it's just to say
No.
once again, and you know, from my part, on all of us, as Peter said, a big thank you, and to let you all the participants who are listening to know that we come back again in this series on 19th December with you know, another continuation of this discussion, and then again on 13th February and on 20th March. You will get the information. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Palmer. Thank you, Dr. Subha. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes. And thank you so much to Salesian College and St. Anthony's College for organizing this. I mean, this is just really wonderful, and it's so wonderful to just jump over the mountains virtually, to be able to have all of these
Going
discussions.
up and down.
Yeah.
Going
So I
up
look
and
forward
down
to
the
the
mountains.
next. Indeed. Just flying over.
Yeah. So thanks to Halkias,
Okay.
who was instrumental in formulating the concept note, to Halkias and everyone in your HKIHSS. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye. Bye.
Physics and maths.
Yes, physics, maths, physics. But in physics, no
Practical,
input
no?
times.
But Albert, can you see me?
George,
Thank you so much.
I can see you.